Session 5 is all about IPv6, next generation computing and broadband technologies. So in this session we'll try and identify some emerging technologies and trends related to and important for the continued development and evolution of the internet. Now we'll kick things off with IPv6. As I mentioned in an earlier session, IPv6 stands for Internet Protocol version 6. This is the next generation of the Internet Protocol, which is intended to replace the current IPv4. The issue with IPv4, of course, has been that it has limited address space, some 4.3 billion IP addresses, much of which have already been allocated to organizations and individuals alike. Now, some estimates tell us that this pool of IPv4 addresses will perhaps run out somewhere between 2010 and 2012 or thereabouts. So what's the issue with IPv4? Well, primarily the issue with IPv4 is that there is not enough IP addresses for a rapidly expanding internet user base. IPv6, on the other hand, gives us something like 340 trillion addresses. So it's vastly greater address space available. One thing that IPv6 will hopefully bring back to the internet is what we call end-to-end connectivity. When the internet was first developed, the idea behind it was that each IP device should be able to reach another IP device without having to go through what we call private networks. Unfortunately, because of limited address space and resources around it, organizations and service providers have had to resort to using what we call the NAT devices, or network address translation devices. Now what these do is that they have what we call a public IP address on one side, and on the other side they give out what's called private IP addresses. Now these private IP addresses are what we say they're not routable on the public internet, which means they're not reachable. You can only reach what's called a public IP address, not a private one on the global public internet. So this has created a problem where we've lost that end-to-end nature of the internet. However, with the vastly increased address space available through IPv6, we should be able to see that end-to-end principle come back again into the internet. Now let's just briefly look at how IPv6 looks like when compared to IPv4, and here I'm referring to the actual notation. This is just some background information for you. You don't have to memorize this or anything, but it's just something good to know. Now IPv4 addresses, very simply put, are 4 groups of digits. For example, something like 202.62.124.238. IPv6 addresses are 8 groups of 4 hexadecimal digits. Now I'm not going to read through all that, but if you look at the slide you'll see what I mean exactly. In a web browser you would just type in an IPv4 address like 202.62.220.198 and it would open up. With an IPv6 address, because it's got a larger sequence of numbers, what you need to do is to put 2 square brackets around that particular address. So again, if you refer to the slide, you'll see exactly what I mean. Now, so what's going to happen? So we say that IPv4 addresses are running out. We need to move to IPv6. But I fear that the developing world is about to face yet another digital divide. And what do I mean by another digital divide? I mean an IPv6 digital divide. Now, let me just elaborate on this a little bit. The developed world is moving quite rapidly to implement IPv6, particularly in the last 12 months or so. There has been an increased interest in seeing how IPv6 can be deployed and taking actions and steps necessary to achieve this. One thing to note is that the United States has mandated that all its government agencies should be IPv6 compliant. So obviously, in the United States at least, this has resulted in service providers and vendors moving quickly to start offering IPv6 services or IPv6 capable products and services. Now once IPv4's exhaustion comes closer, or when it hits home, we will see that the developed world will move very quickly to IPv6, and we do know that in some parts of the world, like in parts of East Asia, this has already started to happen. The problem will be, of course, that you will have the developed world moving to IPv6, but we'll have parts of the developing world still on IPv4. So we would then ask, why does that matter? Well, the problem is that some of these IPv6 services or applications and services that evolve, over the course of time, they will probably start dropping IPv4 support. Now, I'm not saying they will drop IPv4 support, but it is possible that given enough time, people who run these systems will say, look, we are supporting a largely IPv6 audience, so we'll just support IPv6. And this has happened in the past too, when new technology has come about. People have supported the older technology for a while and then have decided, look, we're just moving on to a new technology platform now, we will not worry about supporting that. Just like saying that we used to have Windows 95 computers. Now we supported it for 2 years, but now we are only Windows XP, and from next year will be Windows Vista. We won't have Windows 95 or Windows XP in the network anymore. So it's a similar sort of scenario we're looking at here. Now, if this does happen, what we will have is basically islands existing within the IP world. We will have islands of IPv4, and we will have islands of IPv6. And the problem will be that the islands with IPv4, particularly in the developing world, will not have a means to communicate with the islands that are on IPv6. And that's where the real problem is. So what we'll see is that new applications and technologies and services that evolve in the future, and if these are purely IPv6 dependent, will not be available to the developing world. So the developing world really needs to work on a plan of action starting right now, because really the move cannot happen overnight. You cannot decide today that, okay, from tomorrow will be IPv6, because there's planning required, there are resources required in terms of technical infrastructure as well as human resources to manage and operate these things. So let's say we do take the steps or the necessary actions to move to IPv6. What do we need to do? Or how do we do it? Well, to transition to IPv6, there are a couple of options available. One may elect to run what's called dual stack devices. So these are special routers and equipment which can be configured to talk to both IPv4 and IPv6 networks. So in this way that they can talk between the two. There are things called IPv4, IPv6 translation devices. So basically what these will do is take a request from an IPv6 network, change them to IPv4, send them to an IPv4 network, and then get that information back from that v4 network, reprocess it and send it to a v6 network. So it basically translates between IPv4 and IPv6 traffics. A third option available is IPv4 tunneling over IPv6. So in this way, IPv6 devices that don't really have a direct all IPv6 path between them may be able to communicate by including IPv6 data within an IPv4 data packet. So that's the way tunneling can work, and right now probably tunneling is in common use in a large part of the world where IPv4 connectivity is readily available but IPv6 is not, and when people want to access IPv6 they actually tunnel to an IPv6 service, and there are service providers which offer this. Some are free and some cost money. Now, is IPv6 available? Absolutely, it's available. And on some computer operating systems, Linux in particular, it has been available since 1996. Windows Vista, for example, and the latest incarnation of the Macintosh operating system support this pretty much out of the box. Older Windows-based systems like Windows XP and Windows Server 2003 also have the support, but from what I understand, they need a little bit of tweaking to actually make it work efficiently and effectively. Now, apart from having operating systems that support IPv6, there are also changes required to the domain name system, because currently, as we said in an earlier session, domain name servers basically turn names into numbers. Now, if that number, well, the majority of those numbers as they exist currently are basically IPv4 numbers. But if we move to an IPv6 device, obviously the numbering convention is different. So the DNS needs to be able to convert the names into the IPv4 or IPv6 numbering system, depending on what's required. This is not a very complicated exercise. It's relatively straightforward and relatively easy to implement. And a lot of CCTLDs have started doing this in the Asia Pacific region in particular. These include .jp, which is Japan, .kr, Korea. Those two, I guess, there's no surprises there. Vietnam, .vn has done it, .nz New Zealand has done it, and so has .fj Fiji. Generally speaking, IPv6 uptake has been very slow. I guess one of the reasons is that panic mode is not quite here yet, so people are taking it easy, but maybe it's not too far off. I don't know. I would not like to predict the future in this instance, but I will say that people need to move to IPv6, and it should be part of your general technology plans. One other problem with the IPv6 and its uptake has been that there has not really been a killer application which has had mass market acceptance. Once an application does evolve which requires IPv6 and which the public at large really wants, then of course you will obviously see a greater uptake and interest in IPv6 and a greater demand for services. So that killer application still isn't around, but maybe someday soon it may come about. One thought is that this may actually come out of the gaming world, because gaming is big, particularly in parts of Asia. So perhaps there could be some new evolution of technology which requires IPv6, and that will perhaps become an iteration of the killer application. But let us see what happens. Now, moving on to next generation computing. We all know that internet technology is maturing. It's only been some 30 odd years, but it's been maturing at quite a rapid rate. Now, this is obviously giving rise to some new generation technologies, and it's giving us new and innovative ways to do some of those old things. So let's look at a few of those. Now, first off, let's talk about social networks. Now, remember the good old days when you had shared interests with others and you joined a club or society? Maybe you went into reading books, or maybe an automobile club, or a dog breeding club maybe. You went maybe sailing or surfing perhaps, and you had a bit of a club sort of or society sort of event that you went to. You met as a group. You had discussions. Of course, you talked about your interests, but you also did a bit of chit chat around it, exchanged views and ideas and so on. Well, as things exist nowadays, you can do that without leaving the comfort of your home, or more like the comfort of your PC. Online social networks, which are based on communities of users who have shared interests and activities, and of course who are hopefully interested in interacting with others, have set up a vast community of these amongst many application providers, I guess I could call them. Some names, for example, are Facebook, Friendster, Hi5, Orkut, and so on. So these social networks are all about bringing together communities of people with a shared interest, and then building and evolving that community. So what's available when it comes to social networks? Well, pretty much anything you can think of, from breeding dogs to dating to growing tomatoes, running car clubs, poetry. If you're a sports fan, interested in any number of sports, art, and so on. One interesting thing to note that in the last year or so, perhaps, politicians have taken a very keen interest in the internet and in social networks in particular. We see around the world now that politicians are using the internet as part of the ad campaigning or as part of the campaigning tools, and in some instances it's becoming a very important part of political campaigning to have an internet presence and to have internet lobbying, internet-based lobbying, having communities existing on social networks where people support you or show their support for you. So even politicians haven't left social networks, and they see some value in that. So there must be some interesting things that can happen out of social networks if politicians are involved in them. Now, how do you use a social network? Well, they're typically web-based. They provide features for user interaction. Now, user interaction can be through a whole lot of things. And a lot of people refer to this as Web 2.0 sort of stuff. So it's blogs, discussion forums, interacting with each other, learning things about each other through shared interests and so on. Social networks also can provide you with event information. Some of them provide you with marketplace and trading facilities as well. Some social networks actually exist with a specific target audience. So for example, they're professional networking social networks. An example is LinkedIn, which are business sector based and so on. And they provide opportunities for discussing related issues or for like-minded individuals to get together or to try and improve your professional and business networks, particularly if you want to grow these networks internationally and you don't really have the resources to continually travel to locations overseas. And this next slide shows a typical profile page out of Facebook, and this one in particular is my own profile page. You will see some sections are grayed out because obviously there are some privacy issues around this, where a lot of personal information is available on who's doing what and where they're doing and why they're doing it perhaps. So I've had to gray out the names of my friends and contacts to safeguard their privacy. But as you can see, it's got a lot of information. It's got a lot of options and features available. And some people are also saying that it's becoming a bit of a problem because with these online social networks, we're losing that physical interaction that people have. And in some respects, perhaps that's true, because instead of going out physically to meet someone, you end up sitting in front of your computer and then doing it online. So, but on the other hand, some people have a preference to do it online, and they'd rather not go outside and sit at a computer and do it. So I guess some of it is due to personal choice. But I guess from a personal perspective, I still go out. I would still like to go out and have a beer rather than have a virtual beer. Now this next slide talks about LinkedIn, which is a professional social network. I mentioned this a bit earlier on. So it talks about, it's all about having a professional range of contacts who you can relate to, or perhaps you have a shared interest with. I personally find LinkedIn very useful. I've been on it for quite a while. It's a good tool for me to work out business contacts, as well to find out information about people I know. What their background is, educational background, what their interests are. And sometimes you're able to connect through them with other people who you may find useful in your personal and professional lives. Well, predominantly in your professional life. So these are just two, Facebook and LinkedIn, as examples, and there are many, many more on the internet which you can actually look at. Okay, let's move on from social networks to sensor networks. The computerization of systems and processes, particularly in the industrial world, has led to very rapid advances in sensor networks for control and monitoring purposes. So basically in a factory or plant sort of environment, there's a lot of control and monitoring happening. Now this has evolved out of the industrial world and come into our world, be it home automation or for general use. So you'll see these days that smart chips are being embedded into credit cards, things like contactless cards. So you hold up a card against a door and the door opens for you. So these are being used for access control applications as well as security applications. The next step, of course, and then most of these sensor networks as they exist or as they're deployed are basically self-contained networks. That means they exist as one network within themselves. The next step, of course, is to link these individual sensor networks to a larger network. And of course, in this instance, the internet is a very obvious choice. Now, with the advent of IPv6, so if we have enough addressing space available, it shows us a path that says that yes, we can now link this sensor networks to the internet, and we can start observing and monitoring and controlling things through the internet. A lot of work has been done in this regard worldwide, particularly on wireless sensor networks, and in particular using IPv6 as a means to do it. And Japan in particular has done a lot of work in this. Japanese companies have done a lot of work in this. Of course, some said that there is also an issue with all this, that this is the big brother syndrome. Someone can keep a watch on you, what are you doing, where are you going. So yes, there's some issues around that too. And from a policy perspective, I guess, and in particular a public policy perspective, one needs to balance up all this and see what the right reasons are to deploy these, and if you do deploy them, what things you need to look out for, how do you protect people who use them, how do you protect the ordinary consumer, and so on, who may not be as well versed with this technology and its consequences, as it were. One form of, another form of these is called RFIDs, or radio frequency identification. Now this is a method which uses what's called RFID tags, or little transponders, which store and retrieve data using radio waves. These RFIDs can be installed just into just about any object. You can put them into animals, into equipment, the vehicles, cars, and yes, you can even put them onto humans, which again is more of the Big Brother syndrome maybe. These can be read from several meters away, depending on the technology that is being deployed. Now, in a very rough sense, you can compare these to barcodes and products, where you go into a store, you pick up a product, you take it to the counter, and they scan it with the scanner, and the machine displays its price and what it is. And then of course they do up your bill for you, and you pay for it. But RFIDs are much smarter. They're not just giving one set of information. They can give a whole range of information. They can store a far wider variety of information. The government of Malaysia in particular has incorporated RFID into their passports. So the thinking is that, and I believe they've put this into practice, where a Malaysian citizen does not really have to go through immigration. They just pass through an immigration channel, and the system automatically logs in that they have entered or exited the country. So there's an application of RFIDs which is being used to make people's lives a little bit easier, particularly when you talk about immigration queues and standing in them. I, for one, do not like standing in immigration queues. So Malaysia has done some interesting work to make it a bit better for their citizens. Hong Kong's octopus card. So if you've been to Hong Kong, you maybe have come across the octopus card. That was introduced to pay for people using its mass transit system or its metro system. Since its early days, it's evolved into a payment card for various services. So you can pay for car parks, you can pay for service stations, phone booths, fast food outlets. Will take the octopus card as payment in some locations in Hong Kong. So that's an interesting way of how Hong Kong has developed its smart card payment system, I guess you could call it, and it's had very good and wide acceptance by people in general. Another potential application of RFIDs is for the logging industry, timber logging. So you can track timber logs, when and where they were milled, and how they have been transported, perhaps from source to destination. Also, there is an application where some economies or some countries export fresh products to the world or to other parts of the world. For example, fresh fish, which is caught and then chilled, and then it has to be kept under a certain temperature control regime, and then delivered from source to destination within the temperature regime. So RFIDs can actually be used to track that as that consignment is being transported. The RFID can keep a track of what the temperature variance is, how it's been done, and so on, so that when it's received at the destination, people can do a quick read to see whether did it stay within the limits, in case when it comes to perishable items, if the temperature variation is too high, things like bacteria may set in and the food may get spoiled. So there's an innovative way to monitor such shipments and consignments using RFIDs as a medium. And of course, one of the most obvious applications for RFIDs which exist right now are in retail stores. We'll see products are marked with tags with pricing and security information. So you pick up a garment or an item, you walk to the cashier, you pay for it, and hopefully the cashier, after you've paid for it, will disable or remove the RFID. If he or she hasn't, you take the product and you try and walk out of the store, and there'll be a loud beep that goes off, and then you'll have security guards diving at you trying to stop you from leaving. So that's another application of RFIDs. Here are some interesting slides on RFIDs. Now, this is the microchip developed by Hitachi. It's one of the world's smallest RFID tags, and it measures 0.4 by 0.4 millimeters. And if you look at the picture in the slide, that RFID is being shown in perspective to a human thumb, so you can see how small that is. Now, if you thought that was small, wait till you see this one. This is RFID powder. This measures 0.5 by 0.5 millimeters, and that picture that you see on the slide is shown compared to a strand of human hair. So you can see how small and finite these things are becoming, and I'm sure as technology evolves, it will do even more so. The next slide shows us the installation of an octopus card reader at a MRT station in Hong Kong. MRT is the Mass Rapid Transport System, or the metro system. So basically this is a barrier device. You walk up to the barrier, you hold out your card, so you don't have to swipe it or anything, you just hold it up close. The machine will read your card, ensure there's enough funds, and then take some money out of your card, whatever the amount is, to cross that barrier to get onto the train. And the barrier will open and will let you through. If you don't have sufficient funds, it won't let you through. So, very good and easy method, and it basically allows people to use these transportation systems much more effectively. Now we'll move on to the concept of grid computing. If computers of the kind I have advocated become the computers of the future, then computing may someday be organized as a public utility, just as the telephone system is a public utility. The computer utility could become the basis of a new and important industry. Now, these words were spoken by John McCarthy at the MIT Centennial in 1961. Now that was nearly 50 years ago. In the first session we talked about cloud computing. So if you look at the words that John McCarthy spoke, what he was essentially describing is what we call cloud computing today. So it's very interesting that he predicted this 50 years ago, and today it's reality. Now of course, it's not necessarily only reality today. Other forms of cloud computing have actually existed for quite a while now. If you remember the old days, as it were, of VEX systems and mainframes and dumb terminals, they're pretty much the same principle as what cloud computing is today, of course, but cloud computing is on a far greater and more public scale than what those systems were before. Now, grid computing refers to multiple computers which process information in parallel, connected over some network medium, and as an example, that medium could be the internet. The computers can be geographically dispersed, which differentiates grid computing from clusters and data centers. So in clusters you have machines together, or data centers you have a whole lot of machines in one big room. But with grid computing, the computers don't necessarily have to be on the same in the same building, nor do they have to be on the same segment of the network. They can be on other parts of the larger network. Grid computing is more suited to applications where data can be processed in blocks rather than continual processing. One of the best known public grid computing projects was the SETI at Home project. Now, SETI stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the project was all about analyzing radio signals from space and looking for patterns which may indicate intelligence. Under the SETI at Home project, volunteers would download software which connected back to the SETI project, and then this software in turn would download chunks of data. It would then do a bit of analysis work around it, and then upload it back to the project. The idea was to look for patterns which, as I said before, which would indicate intelligence. And the I guess the attraction for volunteers was that where they were the ones who would discover that there was intelligence in outer space. So it gave them a bit of incentive to do a bit of work. Now, according to estimates provided by the SETI project, using this idle computer time of users connected to the internet, over 2 million years of aggregate computing time was logged. So from a cost perspective, a lot of money was saved by using idle computer time on the public's computers to do all this processing and analysis work. So, a pretty incredible achievement, I think. Now, did they find intelligent life? Not that I'm aware of. Moving on, let's talk about broadband. Now, internet evolution brings new technologies and new applications, and users, of course, will start demanding more. They want rich applications, they want greater interaction, and they want more speed. So primarily broadband internet provides high-speed access to the internet. But how do you actually define broadband? Well, for most intents and purposes, broadband is really a relative term with lots of differing opinions on what broadband is and what it isn't. If we look at ITU's I.113 document, this says that broadband is the transmission capacity faster than primary rate ISDN, which in American markets is 1.5 megabits, and in European markets is 2 megabits per second. The United States Federal Communications Commission defines broadband as 200 kilobits per second in one direction, and advanced broadband with at least 200 kilobits per second in both directions. The OECD in turn defines broadband as 256 kilobits per second in one direction. Now this is usually the most often used definition of broadband. In other words, 256 kilobits in one direction, and that one direction usually is the download direction. Now it's very important to note that broadband is usually delivered as symmetric. What that means is that if you have got a 256 kilobit or 256K internet connection, that means your download speed is 256K. That does not mean your upload speed is. Your upload speed is more likely to be around 64K. And for example, if you have a 512K internet connection, perhaps your upload speed is 128K. And it's very important to realize this difference because the speeds are not the same in both directions. The net effect, of course, of having speeds of a higher download speed and a slower upload speed is that you can download faster, but you can't upload as fast. Now, moving on to IPTV and Internet Television. So IPTV stands for Internet Protocol Television. Now again, this is a new way of doing something old, and it's all about delivering digital television over network infrastructure using IP. Now this may be delivered via broadband internet, or it could be delivered through a closed network where a service provider would engineer this closed network for performance to ensure that they meet quality of service requirements and so on. Often these days people use the term triple play to define services. Now triple play means they offer voice, data and internet together, or voice, internet and video together. Internet television differs from IPTV in the sense that the internet is used as a delivery method, and the internet television may not necessarily be engineered for quality of service, so rather it's provided on a best effort basis. The next slide shows us an example of internet television. Bloomberg, which is a financial news service, offers a 24 hours financial news and information channel, which is available live on the internet, called and it's available at bloomberg.com. And as you can see from the picture, and if you go to the site, you can actually call up the service itself. It's a pretty decent service, and provided you have a decent enough internet connection, it works fine. So you don't really need to watch that on your TV. You could potentially have that running on your PC as you work and keep on listening and hearing as you need to. So an interesting evolution on how television is being delivered these days. Now, pretty much like voice over IP, IPTV and internet television are another paradigm shift. It provides an opportunity for independent content producers the ability to reach a wide radio audience without having to negotiate with television companies to show their products and their programs. There is minimal investment required in terms of infrastructure for internet television in particular, which allows content providers a very quick and easy viewer base. However, from the policy perspective, there are some potential policy issues around this, particularly to do with licensing and service provisioning. From the licensing perspective, usually to broadcast television signals, one needs to have a license. So does the current legislation cover that? How does it cover it? Do you need to differentiate between them? So these are all issues that need to be considered. As well, there is the issue of service provisioning, so that how do you ensure that the customers who subscribe to these services get the quality of service that they expect? So these are all policy and regulatory matters that must be taken into account when you talk about IPTV and internet television. We talked about broadband earlier. It's also good to know how do you actually access broadband. DSL is probably one of the most common ways to deliver broadband services. DSL stands for Digital Subscriber Line. It uses a normal telephone wire to deliver high-speed data connectivity, and just the one cable is used to deliver both voice and internet. Now, how is this facilitated? It's done by a method called multiplexing in the technical world, and what that basically means is that the voice information and the data information are sent down one cable, but they are sent at different frequencies, so that both can exist on the same cable. Normally you will see, if you get a DSL type connection, the service provider will either provide you or will ask you to purchase a DSL filter, And what the filter does is separates those frequencies out so that one cable goes to your telephone and one goes to your internet modem. There is a limitation on distance with DSL technologies. So the further you are from a telecom exchange, the less reliable your connection and the lower speeds possible. And there is, of course, a finite limitation on how far you can be from a telecom exchange to make it work. So that's a limitation with broadband DSL, but it's in very wide use, particularly in the developed world and increasingly in the developing world. And it provides a good method to access broadband internet relatively cheaply. There are various forms of DSL, and you can look at the manuscript to find out more information on that. Another method of broadband access being promoted is through the use of Wi-Fi. Now, Wi-Fi refers to the wireless LAN technology which conforms to IEEE 802.11 standards. Now, I'm not going to get into the standards and what it does and how it does it, but it's suffice to say that today Wi-Fi is nearly an ubiquitous part of everyday life. It's available in just about all current generation laptop computers and even in some mobile phones these days. Wi-Fi hotspots are also increasingly available worldwide, particularly at airports and hotels as an example. The speeds that you can achieve from Wi-Fi these days range from about 11 megabits per second to over 300 megabits per second. And Wi-Fi is a very cheap and easy to deploy technology, particularly for short-range links, although it has been used for longer-range links. Most standard equipment is rated at 100 meters for outdoor use, but realistically speaking, if you use what's called a wireless access point inside a house, typically it gives you around 25 odd meters of coverage, and most times it's limited by the amount of metal you have around it, because metallic objects would actually reflect the signal. So if you have a wireless access network where you are, and for example at your home or in your office, and you have performance issues and so on, it's probably because of signal issues where there's too much reflection of the signal. Wi-Fi has some other limitations. It requires the line of sight, so that means for two systems to communicate, they need to be able to physically see each other. And it is subject to earth curvature. So as you know, the earth is spherical, and as the further you go along, the earth starts to curve away. So if you have two signals which are trying to connect with each other, if they're very far apart, because of the curvature of the earth, the signal sort of goes off into outer space. So that's an important consideration to make, particularly if you're doing medium to long-term Wi-Fi links. Wi-Fi broadcasts on what's called unlicensed frequencies, so congestion issues are possible. Now what this means is that basically anyone can broadcast on a Wi-Fi frequency, so your neighbor can, your neighbor across the street can, your neighbor upstairs can, your neighbor downstairs can. So if you all are broadcasting on the same frequencies and there's only a finite and small number of frequencies available to do this in, then you can have congestion and performance issues. Security is also an issue, particularly with early generation technology and even with current generation technology. So it's very important that you secure your Wi-Fi systems, and obviously you need to have appropriate policies in place to do this. Another method of broadband access is called WiMAX, which stands for Worldwide Interoperability for Microwave Access, and it is also an IEEE standard, denominated as 802.16. It promises cheaper to deploy compared to cable systems and very high-speed broadband access with mobile phone-like coverage. The technical specifications tell us that speeds up to 70 megabits per second are possible, up to some 50 kilometers from a base station. The operating frequencies are much higher compared to other systems like Wi-Fi, so they can range from between 2 to 11 and 10 to 66 gigahertz. Another option for broadband access is 3G, or third generation of mobile phone access technology. These are engineered for audio video streaming and internet access. They can offer transfer speeds up to 3 megabits per second, and current implementations which are in use are usually around 384 kilobits per second for mobile users and around 2 megabits per second for fixed users. Again, needless to say, Korea and Japan were very early adopters of this technology, and that's one of the reasons if you happen to be roaming with your mobile phone in Korea, and if your service provider back home doesn't support a 3G network or doesn't have the necessary interconnection, your phone will actually not work in Korea, in Japan. They also, of course, use a different technology as well sometimes called CDMA, and it also makes a difference there. Now, 3G promises availability of a greater range of services through a mobile phone, particularly when it comes to internet access and other service access, including, let's say, internet television. However, one of the downsides to 3G so far has been that the cost of services have been an issue, which has actually hampered uptake. So from a policy and regulatory perspective, I guess there's a need to look at, yes, 3G is good, we need to bring it in, but we also need to ensure that people can afford 3G services, and how do we go about doing that? So that's something that needs to be considered. There is, the next slide shows you a picture of a phone made by Nokia called the N95. I believe there's a newer version of this available now. But the reason we've put that up there is just to show you what an advanced 3G phone looks like. You know, it's got all the usual standard features these days most smartphones have. And it includes a GPS map, so it's got a global positioning system capabilities built in. It's got a music player, it can do DVD quality video playback, and of course it also gives you Wi-Fi access. I understand the newer versions of this phone actually now comes with a QWERTY keyboard, so it's got the look and feel of a normal keyboard, so which makes using the device much easier. Of course, one of the issues with most of these sophisticated devices is that they have issues with battery life. So they are currently, there's currently a lot of research and development happening with battery life to try and see how we can make these devices last longer using batteries. I'll talk a little bit about AirJaldi, and again you can refer to the manuscript which has a lot of information about the AirJaldi network. Now this is a large community-based wireless network which is located in and around Dharamsala in India, which is in the mountainous terrain around the foothills of the Himalayas. The network itself serves surrounding towns and villages using a Wi-Fi mesh type network. And really the catalyst for this to happen was when the Indian government decided to deregulate Wi-Fi. And it has led to the evolution of this network. And the organization that does this itself, just apart from setting up these networks, they've also contributed back to the community or to the technical community in terms of development of systems and process to suit and support this Wi-Fi mesh network. So it's led to a lot of innovation in that regard. Users are currently charged a nominal fee to access the network, but as part of the deal, they need to become another node on the mesh. So this keeps on expanding the reach and redundancy of the network. So that's a good idea with this mesh networking concept. What the network is used for is for internet access, for file sharing. It's used for offsite backups, video playback, as well as voice over IP, telephony, and so on. A lot of these devices are actually powered by solar panels because regular electricity supply is sometimes an issue in these locations. So all in all, it's a very good case study to look at to see how a community network could be set up and how it's able to provide the whole range of services to the community that resides within that area. So please have a look at the manuscript and you'll see a whole lot more information about that network, as well as you can find links to their websites as well for further information. Now finally, we'd like to cover a little bit, and then very briefly we'll just go through the concept of interoperability. Now interoperability refers to the ability of discrete and diverse systems to work together without requiring extra effort by the user. Now this is, the concept of interoperability is increasingly becoming more important, particularly with the advent of technology such as cloud computing, which assumes that devices will be compatible. So it doesn't assume that they'll be non-compatible, it assumes it will be compatible. So you need to ensure that devices are interoperable. Perhaps one of the best examples of interoperability is the actual mobile phone network itself, where you have mobile phones being manufactured by a whole variety of manufacturers. You have the back-end systems which support these mobile phones, like the towers and the exchange switches and all that, being manufactured by a different vendor or a range of vendors as well. And all these systems are able to work with each other pretty much seamlessly because they're all interoperable. They all work off a standard set of standards, a set of standards, and interoperability really has been the key to the success of of mobile networks to some extent. One of the things interoperability also does, of course, is that it fosters competition by ensuring products can coexist. As well, it guards against monopolistic behavior, where you may have one vendor who will have a whole technology locked in, or a whole community or market locked in, because they're the only ones providing that service. So interoperability allows a bit of competition, and it guards against monopolistic behavior. It also contributes to the concept of sharing knowledge, because as we often say, that the value of knowledge can only grow if we continue to share it. So with that, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you in the next session.